In 1934, some Dust Bowl families owned land, livestock, and a kitchen, and still had nothing to eat. They couldn't kill the cow. The crops had turned to dust, so dinner became a countdown. Stretch it, save it, or leave. And the final meal traveled west with them. The Dust Bowl did not begin with one bad harvest. For decades, prairie grass had been removed. Fields were overworked, and the soil was left exposed. Then the drought came. The wind lifted the soil and carried it across the plains. Dust entered through windows. It covered tables. It filled barns, kitchens, and water troughs. But hunger had already begun before the worst storms arrived. Crop prices had fallen. Debts remained, and many farms were already struggling to survive. Then the land stopped producing. The animals became harder to feed. The pantry became smaller, and every meal became a decision. How much could be stretched? What had to be saved? Which animal could be eaten? And which animal had to stay alive? This is not a story about simple food. It is a story about people managing scarcity until there was almost nothing left to manage. 10. Cornbread, the meal that asked for nothing. Cornbread could be made with almost nothing. Cornmeal, water, salt, maybe a little fat, maybe milk, and sometimes nothing else. It could be baked into a loaf, cooked into mush, or turned into dumplings. That made it valuable in a crisis. It did not require a garden. It did not require fresh meat, and it could be made from grain grown or milled nearby. A pan of cornbread could fill the table without filling every stomach. One piece might go with beans. Another might be saved for breakfast. A third might be wrapped in cloth and carried into the fields. That was the first rule of the Dust Bowl kitchen. Food did not have to be impressive. It had to last, but cornbread could only hide hunger for so long. A family needed something to make it heavier, something that could stay in a pot, something that could become tomorrow's dinner. Cornbread could make a small meal feel larger, but the next food was what made one meal become several. 9. Beans. The pot that had to last beans were cheap. They stored well, and one pot could feed a family more than once. That mattered when money was disappearing. The beans could be cooked in the morning, served at midday, and reheated at night. The liquid could be kept. The leftovers could be thinned. A small amount of meat, if available, was often used for flavor instead of volume. The beans did the heavy work, but stretching them changed the meal. At first, the pot might be thick. By dinner, it might be mostly broth. The food did not become thinner because the cook had failed. It became thinner because more people had to eat. This was not wasteful cooking. It was mathematical cooking. The question was not, is this enough for dinner? The question was, how many meals can this become? And that question became more urgent when another basic resource began disappearing. Water. Fuel, and the food produced by the last animal still alive. The next food was not simply served at the table. It had to survive before it could feed anyone. 8. Milk, the last dependable protein. For families who still had a dairy cow, milk could be one of the last dependable foods. It could be drunk fresh, poured over cornbread, added to a thin meal, or shared among children first. Unlike a crop, milk did not require waiting for harvest, but the cow needed food before the family could receive milk. When grass disappeared and feed became expensive, the family's food supply depended on the animal's food supply. The cow was not just dinner. It was future dinner. It was income. It was a reason to stay. Protecting it became a daily struggle. A family might be hungry and still refuse to slaughter it because killing the cow could solve one meal and destroy the next 100. That was the cruel logic of the Dust Bowl. The animal closest to the kitchen might be the animal nobody could afford to eat. Imagine being surrounded by livestock and still going hungry. That was not a contradiction. It was the economic reality. 7. The animal. They didn't eat a steer looked like food, but to a struggling farmer it could also be money. Walking toward market, Killing it might provide meat for a few days. Keeping it alive might preserve the family's only chance of income. So, families had to choose between food now and the possibility of food later. That decision could involve cattle, chickens, horses, or breeding animals. Some animals produced milk, some produced eggs, some could be sold, some were needed for work. Eating one might feel like survival, but it could also be the final step toward losing the farm. Federal drought relief efforts eventually purchased livestock from farmers who could no longer feed them. That policy revealed how severe the crisis had become. The problem was no longer simply a bad recipe. The entire agricultural system was collapsing. And when the animal could not be spared, families returned to the pot. They added more water, more grain, more time, until even soup became a form of accounting. A family could still own the land and still lose the ability to live from it. 6. The math of a thin soup. A thin soup could begin with beans or potatoes or corn or vegetables or scraps saved from an earlier meal. The ingredients changed, the method remained the same. Take what exists, add water, use heat, make it reach farther. A thick stew might feed fewer people. A thin soup might keep everyone from eating nothing. So the pot changed during the day. At lunch, it might contain visible pieces. By dinner, it might be mostly broth. The liquid still carried flavor. It still carried small amounts of nourishment. And it still gave the family the feeling that there was food in the house. That feeling mattered. Because hunger is not only physical. It is the fear of knowing there may be nothing tomorrow. But families could not stretch food forever. Eventually, the pot became too thin. The garden produced too little, and the last vegetables had to be preserved before the land stopped giving anything at all. The most valuable food in the kitchen was not always the food being eaten. Sometimes it was the food being saved for a month that had not arrived yet. 5. Homemade chow chow. Chow chow turned leftover vegetables into something that could last. Cabbage, dark green tomatoes, peppers, onions, vinegar. Whatever the garden had managed to produce, the ingredients varied from household to household, but the purpose was the same: save the harvest before it disappeared. Fresh vegetables had a short life. A preserved jar could extend that life for months. A small serving could add flavor to beans, cornbread, or potatoes, but the jar meant more than flavor. It represented time. It meant that food from one season could survive into another. When the garden was empty, the shelf still held something. That was a small form of control in a world ruled by drought. But even preservation had a limit. Eventually, the jars were opened, the vegetables were eaten, and the shelves became empty. Then families had to look beyond the garden. If forgotten food history matters to you, follow now, because the next meal was gathered from the land itself. And knowing what was safe could mean the difference between eating and getting sick. 4. Wild greens. Some families gathered wild greens when cultivated food became scarce. Dandelion, lamb's quarters, and other plants known through local and family knowledge. But this was not casual experimentation. What was safe depended on the region, the season, and the person identifying it. A plant that one community recognized could be dangerous to someone unfamiliar with it. So historical foraging was not about guessing. It depended on memory, neighbors, experience, and careful preparation. Wild greens could add variety to a diet built mostly from beans, bread, and soup, but their presence also revealed something painful. The family was no longer eating only what it had planted. It was eating what the landscape still allowed. Some people had the knowledge to do that safely, others did not, and no amount of knowledge could make the drought disappear. Soon, one family's memory would reveal how small a meal could become and still be remembered as good, not abundant, not comfortable, good. That single word explains how completely hunger had changed the meaning of food. 3. The meal, a family still called good. One remembered account described a family living largely on cornbread, beans, milk, and chow chow. By modern standards, it would have looked painfully small. There might be no extra portions, no variety, no certainty about tomorrow, and yet the family remembered it as good food. That does not mean the hardship was easy. It means people judge a meal by the world around them. When neighbors have less, a bowl shared fairly can feel like security. When the pantry is nearly empty, warm food can feel like victory. And when the future is uncertain, familiar food can restore a small piece of normal life. People remember the taste, but they also remember who was sitting nearby. They remember how the food was divided. They remember the sound of the pot. The word good did not erase hunger. It showed how families protected dignity while living with it, but dignity could not repair the farm. A good meal could not bring back the rain, and eventually the question was no longer what to cook. It was whether there was anything left to cook. 2. When owning land stopped. Meaning food. A farm could belong to a family and still fail to feed that family. The deed might remain in a drawer. The farmhouse might still stand. The fields might still surround the house, but ownership could not create rain. It could not restore topsoil. It could not lower debt, and it could not turn dust back into a crop. For many families, the farm economy had already weakened before the worst drought years. Prices had fallen, debts remained, and the distance between survival and failure became smaller each season. Then the crops failed. The animals became harder to feed. The pantry emptied. The farm became a place where the family lived, but could no longer live from. That changed the meaning of home. The farmhouse was no longer only shelter. It became a question. How many meals are left? How long can we stay? What can be sold? What can be carried? What must be abandoned? Soil conservation and federal relief efforts eventually responded to the disaster, but those efforts came after families had already endured years of pressure. They could not restore every crop. They could not reopen every abandoned kitchen, and they could not make every family stay. Millions left the Dust Bowl region during the 1930s. When they left, they could not carry a complete kitchen. They carried only what could survive the road. The final survival strategy was not finding a better recipe. It was making the recipe portable. 1. The meal that traveled west. When a family left the farm, the kitchen had to be reduced to what could be carried. Beans went into sacks. Cornmeal was wrapped and packed. Jars were protected with cloth. A cooking pot became one of the most valuable objects in the vehicle. It could turn basic ingredients into a meal almost anywhere. The family might leave behind furniture, tools, farm equipment, a familiar room. But the cookware mattered because it carried continuity. The same beans cooked in the farmhouse could simmer beside a campfire. The same cornbread could be divided between people who had lost nearly everything else. The same food knowledge could survive after the land was gone. That is why the meal traveled west. Not because it was luxurious, because it was adaptable. It could be prepared in a kitchen, beside a road, in a temporary camp, or wherever a family could make a fire. But migration did not solve hunger. The road brought uncertainty, temporary work, exhaustion, and the constant fear of running out again. No recipe could replace rain. No preserved jar could feed a family forever. And no amount of ingenuity could make deprivation disappear. The meal traveled because the people had to travel, and the food survived. But the life surrounding it did not. These foods were not proof that poverty was comfortable. They were proof that families learned to manage disaster one meal at a time. Cornbread made a small amount of food feel larger. Beans turned one pot into several meals. Milk provided nourishment while the animal producing it had to be protected. Livestock could not always be eaten because it represented future income. Thin soup transformed scarcity into another day. Chow chow preserved the garden after the garden disappeared. Wild greens required knowledge, caution, and local memory. A small meal could still be remembered as good because dignity mattered when abundance was impossible. Land could remain legally owned while becoming economically useless. And finally, the meal itself had to become portable. The real lesson is not that Dust Bowl families simply knew how to make do. The real lesson is that they were forced to make do with fewer and fewer choices. Their ingenuity was real. So was their deprivation. Every spoonful had a history. Every empty jar had a reason. And every meal carried the same unanswered question. Would there be enough left to cook tomorrow? When the land could no longer provide food, families carried their cooking knowledge onto the road. But the next story begins after they left the farmhouse. It begins in migrant camps, beside temporary fires, where dinner had to be made with whatever could survive the journey. The next frontier meal is even harder to forget. Follow for the rest of America's forgotten food history.